Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. We'll make a start now. I know a few people might be joining us as we start. So welcome to our third session of our leadership CPD. So if you just bear with me one moment, there we go. So our focus has been building a culture of collective responsibility, and we've had two webinars before this one. So if you didn't see part one or part two, I've put the link there on the screen and it'll be in the chat for you. It is worth going to have a look at part one, where Malcolm Reeve really goes through national SEND data and effective use of this in your schools. And then part two offers a range of case studies from SENCOs who've recently had Ofsted inspections. So if you haven't seen those, it is worth going back to have a little look, even just flicking through the slides. So you know where we're at. So today's session is kind of pulling together all of those parts from session one, session two. So it's a little bit of everything, but hopefully it all joins up. So we're going to start off with a review of the autumn term inspection data. So looking at the Ofsted data for autumn term 2. And then we're also going to focus on one of the themes that arose from the previous session, which is looking at leading literacy and reading for pleasure. That's something that a lot of SENCOs, a lot of colleagues are looking at. So we're going to have a case study presented from a literacy lead. And then really to reflect on leadership of SEND from a curriculum point of view, we're going to be considering how as SEND leads or school leaders, we make sure our CPD is effective and we have that culture of collective responsibility where basically everyone gets on board the SEND bus, you know, everyone's flying that flag. So how do we get our colleagues to change? So we're going to be looking at that. So there's 3 sections. I'm going to start off looking at the data. Then Emily Fraser, who's the literacy lead from West Baldon Primary School, is going to present the case study. And then we have Gary Albin, who's a SEND content specialist at EEF, and he's going to be looking at effective CPD. Now, unfortunately, Gary can't be with us today, so it is a pre-recorded video, but we should be able to access that quite easily. Okay, so there's 3 sections, hopefully something for everyone as we start. Right, so we're going to have a look now at the autumn Ofsted data. As we've said before in whole school SEND sessions, everything isn't about Ofsted. But sometimes it's just really useful. It's useful for us to reflect, and it can be quite motivating for the colleagues if they can see how other settings are getting on and if they can have a look at reports. If you're not aware of the website Watchsted, I'd recommend you have a look. It's something that's really useful because you can find the latest inspection reports from primary, nursery, secondary schools. You can look for similar settings to your own and see how they've fared. It's just really, really helpful. So I've got a bigger map there. So this is an example of what you can look at. So the green dots are outstanding, grey are good, and yellow are requires improvement, red inadequate. So you can get a real map of what's going on around you, and you can kind of zoom in and then get all the links to the reports. So that's something that I use quite a lot, and it's just helpful if you haven't already seen that. So what we've done at Whole School SEND is we've had a look at all of the inspection reports that were published in October, November and December this year. We chose from October onwards because that's when really the Ofsted focus was moving away from COVID. Yes, there was still some COVID questions and colleagues were still reporting that they were having those discussions, but it wasn't that kind of, right, how are things in the immediate recovery. So we've looked at all of the reports and we've collated together all of the comments relating to SEND. So it's a really good data set for any school leader or SENCO to just have a look at what sort of things other settings are focusing on. So it's a good reference tool. And really, we found what we expected. In the reports, the Ofsted priorities were really coming through quite strongly. Curriculum planning focuses really highly, and looking at the roles of all leaders as leaders of SEND. And obviously we're here for that. We're looking at collective responsibility and all leaders of SEND. So I'm just going to go through some of the data sets. There's absolutely loads, but I've highlighted some key points. And at the end of the webinar, when we publish all of the slides, which will probably be tomorrow, you will have access to all of these different slides, so you can have a look at them yourself. So we'll start off with the data from primary schools. 902 visits, 297 primary schools got ratings. You can see only 7% were rated as outstanding. What we've done is we've grouped together all of the comments by outcome. So we've grouped together the outstanding, good, alright, and inadequate comments for us to have a look at. And this is how we've displayed it, just in text boxes, just copied straight from the reports. It's just useful to have a look at, and we know that SENCOs and school leaders will be working in settings which are at different phases of a journey, of a school improvement journey, but it's just useful to look at it from this perspective. So something that I've started to pick out, and this is from my sort of perspective, looking at the work I'm doing across some settings I'm working in, it's very clear that this idea of access to curriculum and SEND students having the same opportunities is coming through. So in the settings that were very successful and got outstanding, this is what was mentioned in the report, this idea that pupils with SEND are learning the same vocabulary as their peers. It's the same for them as for others. So I thought that was an interesting point to pull out. Now, I'm not going to go through every single slide in detail, but I'm just going to pick out a few themes. So we've also grouped together the comments from schools that have been rated good. So if you're at that stage, it's really helpful to have a read through, not like a checklist, but you can start to look at some themes and see if your setting matches those. What I've also done is we've had a look at the other end of the spectrum, so some settings that require improvement and what sort of themes and issues are coming out from those reports. And this isn't really a surprise, because this is something that was mentioned in our previous session, where SENCOs were being asked quite a lot about challenge and the appropriate level of challenge for the SEND students. And we can see it coming out here in the highlighted bits, this idea that the work is too easy and too hard, and how important it is for curriculum leaders to be looking at the balance of the work that they're providing. Is it appropriate? So that's something to be just thinking about. So we've got all of the statements from primary schools, and we've also put together statements from secondary schools. Now, I know I've gone through those very quickly, but remember they'll be available at the end. So secondary schools, it is a smaller data set. Only 4%, so only 6 schools were rated outstanding. Now, one of these schools, Archbishop Holgate School in York, actually participated in our second leadership session. So if you haven't seen that case study presented by their SENCO, Meg Holmes, I'd urge you to go back and have a look, because that school's only one of 6 that was graded outstanding. So we've done exactly the same again by grouping together the statements from the outstanding reports. And then I've highlighted a few issues that came to mind. So in the first set, this common theme is really around information sharing. And if we've got colleagues online who are secondary SENCOs or working in post-16 colleges, I think this issue was always present in our minds of how do we share information with all of the different teaching staff who are working with our students. And schools who are doing this well, this information sharing has been mentioned in their report, this idea of this clear guidance, detailed on student needs. So it's worth reflecting on your setting. Is the information clear? Is it easily accessed? Is it accessed through kind of one click and then you're into a register? Or is it you having to go and search in different places? So that's coming through really strongly in the report. So all of this will be available afterwards, but I'm just going to look at the other side of the spectrum. So we're looking now at secondary schools which were rated inadequate. And I think this is really powerful data to share if you're working in a school which is on a bit of a journey, is looking at school improvement, because all of the statements are linked to curriculum. if the curriculum isn't right for SEND students, that comes through really strongly. If SEND isn't considered, so if student plans aren't considered, and if the curriculum hasn't been made accessible, and if SEND needs haven't been looked at, then that comes through really strongly in the report. So I think this is a good tool for you to be able to speak to other school leaders or curriculum leads, and just highlight that this is what Ofsted are finding. It's all in one place. This is what we need to be focusing on when we're looking at SEND improvement. So all of those collated comments will be available in the slide pack for you to have a look at, including my highlighted notes. And I just need to say thank you to Malcolm Reeve, who pulled together all of that work over his Christmas holidays. So that was really helpful for us. And I think it is powerful to use up-to-date data when you're talking to staff and trying to get that buy-in. So the next thing I want to show you this afternoon is looking at how we can share resources, sharing useful, effective resources with colleagues within our setting. So you might have seen this on the Whole School SEND website. We've just launched our teacher handbook for SEND. It's a huge document, it's 185 pages, but it's really useful to use because the whole table of content is hyperlinked. So you can click on a section and go straight to the bit that you need. And the section that I really want to show you today is section 5, which is subject specific guidance. Sometimes when I'm asked to do SEND training as a SENCO, it can feel a little bit general, and you want to hang it on subject. You want to say, well, in science, have you considered this? But it's really difficult to find resources to do that with. So you can see the list on the screen. There's guidance covering primary and secondary, maths, English, drama, science, music, art and design, PE, computing, and MFL. Now, MFL is something that often comes up in secondary because it can be very tricky for some students with particular needs to access. So when you're working with curriculum leads, it's really helpful to say, actually, have you seen this guidance? It's related to your subject. Then it isn't just general quality first teaching advice. It's directly linked to their specialism. So I've just picked out the secondary science section. I thought this was really useful because there's curriculum considerations for Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4. And looking back to that, those collated statements from Ofsted, SEND students have to be considered at the curriculum planning stage. So if you've got a science department or a department that are really struggling with that, here's some guidance, subject specific, which you can show them and which might help. Also goes into challenging misconceptions, how can you support learners with particular needs in the subject, and how you present information, conceptual understanding. So it's just a really good resource to share in your school. So I just wanted to share that out. Okay. Right, so moving on now, so that's the end of my section. I'm delighted to introduce Emily Fraser, who's the literacy lead and reception teacher at West Baldon Primary School. Now, Emily's our first non-SENCO speaker in this series, and we're really pleased to have her on board. She's going to go through a case study of literacy and working with a SENCO, and I know she's going to mention a recent Ofsted visit as well. So I'll hand over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Oh God, I'm losing my voice. Hi everyone, I'm obviously Emily. I'm literacy lead and reception teacher at West Baldon Primary School. A little bit about our school. So West Baldon Primary School is a mixed primary school in South Tyneside. It's quite a disadvantaged area. We have 253 children who are on roll, and 76 of those children do have a diagnosis of SEN, and we've got 8 children who have educational healthcare plans. We do also have a lot of children who have additional needs, so we've had to think quite a lot about how we're going to meet those needs throughout our whole curriculum. And we do have high numbers of absence, which is something that we've also thought about when we're catering for our SEN children. So I'm going to start with phonics. We use read, write, ink phonics for our children in Key Stage 1 and early years. However, we do have a high number of children in Key Stage 2 who still need to access phonics. They might be SEN, or they might just be working lower than age-related expectations. So what we planned for was this year, kind of as our COVID catch-up as well, that those children in Key Stage 2 would have their phonics before school starts. So we've actually extended the school day for some children. Our teaching assistants deliver those phonics interventions, and they've all had read, write, ink training, and they are regularly updated by myself. These children are assessed half-termly the same as our Key Stage 1 children, and they do continue to take home a decodable reader. We have a lot of phonics interventions going on throughout our school from early years up to year 6. The children are given targeted one-to-one specific interventions for themselves, which again are delivered by a familiar adult. These interventions do change quite regularly. Our children are assessed every 6 weeks, but if we have regular conversations, and if our adults feel that, you know, something needs changed within that time, we do change it. Staff are all given regular updates on their phonics group, not just the children who are in their regular class, and they're all provided information on their progress, whether it be positive or negative, the next steps, and we have quite a good relationship. We've got a good, strong team going on within our early years and phonics, and staff are more than comfortable to come and say, you know, Emily, I need some help with this, could you model this? And we kind of have a real team effort approach, and staff are happy to model for each other. And I feel like that's worked quite well since we've been working with the English Hub. We've been working with the English Hub for about 1.5 years now, and we have a specialist that comes in every 6 weeks and works with myself and make sure that I'm assessing correctly, that the children are all in the correct groups, and we go through all of the updates and do some kind of staff training, and we work together and do a bit of coaching with the English Hub. So that's been a really positive experience for all of our staff. When I took over as reading lead and literacy lead, reading was definitely a priority. We had historical low engagement of reading at home. It wasn't something that was thought of as a priority by our parents, and the kids needed something to really engage them. So this year I've introduced a whole school reading incentive, and it's accessible for all of our children, which was something that was really important. I didn't want, you know, the children who weren't as strong readers to not be able to engage in the same thing as their peers. So the children all have a reading bookmark as shown on the PowerPoint, and they have to collect 10 stamps over the half term. So they do that by reading 3 times a week, and they get a sticker or a stamp on their chart. But the children are all able to read a book that's appropriate for their level, so it's accessible and all of our children feel included. We found that having a whole class reading scheme didn't really work, because it was the same children would read over and over again, and we found that, you know, some of our children who weren't confident readers, you know, they weren't engaged by this. It was overwhelming. You know, their friends were reading really long chapter books, but they still needed a decodable reader, whereas this time they're able to just do their own thing, and they can all access it by themselves, so they don't need to think about what anybody else is doing. So we have had okay engagement. It was our first full term just gone, but we weren't really able to promote it without having, you know, all of assemblies were cancelled. There was no kind of get togethers that we could, you know, say this is how it's going to work and everybody's going to do this. So I think that now we're able to have our assemblies back and things, we can really promote this a bit more. Reading for pleasure, again, was something that we knew we needed to work on. So last year we did our first whole school sponsored read. And again, it was very inclusive. The children could choose which books they wanted to read. It was a series of different challenges. So, for example, can you read a book that starts with the letter T? Can you read a book to a grandparent? Can you read a book that has a red front cover? And the children could go at their own pace. They could read whichever books they liked. It was accessible for our whole school. So that was really successful, and we managed to raise over £1,000. So with that money, we created a library in our hall, and I worked alongside all of the children who had raised the money, and we picked all of the books that we wanted together, and we bought those. We're actually in the process of, we're going to have another sponsored read we used a lady who works with Usborne Books, and she was really helpful, and it was really successful. So we're going to have another one of those in this spring half term. Guided reading. Was something that was not done consistently throughout our school. We had, in year 6, they were using kind of a reciprocal reading approach. In year 1, we had different groups of guided reading going on, and in different places we were just not consistent at all, which was obviously not good for the children and really not good for the staff either. So I decided that I wanted to go with an approach using the Ashley Booth model, which I think there is a link going to be coming out for. And we were going to have consistency throughout our school. I wanted it to be something that was inclusive for all of our children. I didn't want it to be like, well, no, some children can't access this, so they'll do something different. For me, it had to be something where we were all on board. Initially, a lot of our staff, well, some of our staff weren't really on board with this because they thought that certain children weren't. So we've worked together and we kind of modelled some sessions for staff, and we've got the luxury of we do have a TA in nearly every classroom. So the teaching assistants have been working alongside some of our SEN and lower ability children so that they can access the same thing as their peers. So, they might have a little bit of extra support with some vocabulary or some different types of questioning. But for me, it was really key that all children access the same structure to the guided reading session. So the children in our school now all have guided reading at exactly the same time. So it's been nice for when I do learning walks as literacy coordinator that I can go around and everybody's doing everything at the same time. We use, that's just a link to the Ashley Booth model. We use these Vipers models, so they're quite similar to the reciprocal reading. So we have a key stage 1 and a key stage 2 version, and it's just to try and make sure that our children have access to these skills and to lots of different types of questioning. And our staff are really on board now, and I know our staff in year 3 and 4 actually say that guided reading is their favourite part of the day, so that's been really nice to hear. Working with a SENCO. So I do actually work quite closely with Steve, our SENCO. And we have got a real whole school approach to our whole literacy curriculum. I've created a reading spine for the whole school. So we've got lots of really nice language rich texts. And obviously we've made big changes to our guided reading and to our phonics to make sure that it is really inclusive for all of the children in our school. The staff who teach phonics are not only responsible for the children in their own class, but they're also responsible for children within all of Key Stage 1, because we swap our groups quite regularly, and staff are really passionate about making sure that the children in their groups are making good progress. We do have regular communication and regular meetings to, so all staff are aware of the needs of all of the children in our school. And I think what's been really nice is we've been able to share lots of positive progress and positive results with our staff, and that's been really good for motivation and for momentum, and for doing the same, like continuing with our good practice. Staff have it's been really nice to see that we've made such good progress. And obviously we've just recently had Ofsted. I think it was about 3 weeks into the autumn 1 term, which was a bit scary, but Ofsted, it was a really positive experience, and they were really happy with a lot of the things that we do in terms of including all of our children with needs, or who are working below where they're expected to. So they really liked our reading spine. They liked that we have a vast range of texts, so that our children are exposed to these language rich texts. They really were happy with our approach to early reading. So we start our phonics from reception at week 3, so we kind of hit the ground running, and we're able to then get those interventions for our lower ability and SEN children in place, as quickly as possible. They really liked that we've got a range of interventions going on before school and in school. So our phonics, our reading plus, our additional readers, we've got quite a lot of intervention going on, and they like that. And then they really liked how our teaching assistants work so closely with our one-to-one children who have educational healthcare plans. They really liked how, our teaching assistants get to know those children so well. They know exactly what they need. They push them where it's appropriate, and they were really happy with that. So that was all really positive. But if anybody's got any questions, I'm more than happy for anyone to email me. I've got resources to share, or if anybody wanted to ask anything else, I'm more than happy for that. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. If you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'll get a chance to come back to those a bit later on. So Emily's just gone over there, basically how, as literacy lead, she's approached the role looking at it's inclusive by design, isn't it? Everything that she's put in place. So it's, accessible, the same as peers, inclusive. If all curriculum leads had that approach, the SENCO's job would be really easy. But obviously every school doesn't have an Emily, unfortunately. So the next section of this presentation is going to be looking at how do we get buy-in from staff, and looking at effective professional development. And I asked Gary Albin, who's the SEND content specialist from the EEF, and he's also head of SEND for Multi-Academy Trust. And he's also, I'm going to plug his book because it is quite good. He's also the author of this book you might have seen on Twitter called The Lone SENCO, which is full of questions and answers about everything related to the SENCO role. So I've asked him to, so someone's just said it arrived today in the chat, that's great. So I've asked him to really look at how do we get this buy-in, how do you create more Emilys who are subject leads in schools, who are thinking from the start about inclusion when they're designing their curriculum.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gary Albin. I work with the Education Endowment Foundation for 2 days a week, and my my day job, I suppose, I lead on SEND provision for a multi-academy trust that's 10 schools in London and Hertfordshire. And I've been invited to just contribute today to talk about how SENCOs and school leaders can make sure that SEND becomes everyone's responsibility, with a real focus on middle leaders and with a particular focus on curriculum and phase leads. So although I'm sorry not to be able to be with you today, I hope I say something that you can take away and find useful. Just a quick introduction to the work of the EEF for those who may not be familiar with it. So it's committed and dedicated to breaking that link between family income and educational achievement, that shows that if you are from a more deprived or disadvantaged background, then you'll be making less progress than other students, and that will increase over time as you go through the school system. So the EEF wants to break that cycle, and one of the ways it likes to do it in particular is through the use of evidence. So what it does is it generates evidence, it tries to synthesize evidence rather, to make it useful for schools and school leaders, and then to make sure that that can be mobilized through the Research Schools Network and through schools doing the work on the ground. So the idea is that it makes evidence, or good evidence, robust evidence around what works within teaching and learning, more available and accessible to schools and school leaders and teachers, so that they might ultimately support the outcomes of children learning in schools, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's the work of the EEF in a nutshell. The EEF does some work that's explicitly around SEND. So it offers, for example, a deep dive into the evidence around SEND. It has SEND as a thread that runs through other training programs that it offers. It also, as part of its desire to increase the research and the evidence base, commissions research trials. So currently, the whole school SEND review guides are part of a trial nationally to see if when schools engage with these review guides and engage with the whole school SEND program, their outcomes for pupils with SEND improve over time. It also does currently review trials around a couple of intervention programs in particular there. But one piece of work that's done really that I'd like to talk a bit more about today is it conducted a big evidence review around SEND. So it asked several questions around what are useful things for schools to do to support the outcomes of students with SEND. So it conducted this evidence review, which involved looking at lots and lots of meta-analyses, over 100 meta-analyses, incorporating thousands of studies that have taken place already around what works for students with SEND, to then synthesize those into something and some recommendations that schools can take forward and find very useful. So that ultimately created the SEN in Mainstream guidance report that you may be familiar with, and if you're not, it's on the EEF website. Please do go and have a look at it. And alongside that guidance report are various tools that schools may be able to use when they're working with staff around that school's SEND provision. And there are some blogs and things, of which there are links to 3 on the slide you can see now, that schools might find useful. So that's some of the work that EEF does within SEND. And I talked about the SEN in Mainstream guidance report, and these are 5 recommendations that it came up with, that schools should be doing these 5 things because that's what the evidence strongly suggests is going to make a difference. These are not sort of top of the head thoughts. This is based on really good evidence in many cases around what works for students with SEND. So just to shine a light on those 5 in particular, it's about number 1, that positive and supportive environment for pupils. Number 2 is about the understanding of pupils and their needs. Number 3, about accessing high quality teaching. Number 4 is about doing some really good and carefully selected interventions. And number 5 is around working with teaching assistants. So I won't try and go through all of them today, because I do want to have that focus on curriculum and phase leads in particular. But I want to talk a bit more about ensuring that all pupils have access to high quality teaching, because I believe personally that that's the greatest thing, that many other issues don't become issues if the teaching is great and accessible and allows all students a chance to succeed and to be challenged. So fewer EHCP applications need to be written if the classroom teaching is going well. Fewer interventions need to be run if the classroom teaching is going well. Even fewer teaching assistants might be needed across your school if the teaching is meeting the needs of all learners. So that's ultimately what we want to try and do. So that's why I want to just shine that light on number 3 a little bit now. So the SEN in Mainstream guidance report, I've just taken 3 bullet points and then 5 little particular approaches that it highlights. And I'll just pause for a moment to allow you to read those. So what it's not saying is that this is the answer to everything. There may be a child who's autistic for whom a now and next board is absolutely essential and isn't covered by these 5 approaches that are written here. And there'll be many examples. If a child has a visual impairment and needs a certain font size in order to access written materials, well, there's no getting around that. But what this does do with these 5 approaches is say, look, they're already in the repertoire of many teachers, and if teachers can use them with a bit of a nuance for students with SEND, but really using them consistently for students with SEND and others, this is what the evidence shows can make a positive difference for students. So those 5 things are flexible grouping, cognitive and metacognitive strategies, explicit instruction, using technology to support pupils with SEND, and scaffolding. So I won't talk in detail about all of them. But what I'd just like to do is consider, well, if we know what works, if we know what's going to be useful, which is, you know, some combination of these 5 approaches, that's going to help more students with SEND to make good academic progress in school and to feel more successful in the class, be more successful in the class. Well, we know, so let's say we know that. We know what the evidence certainly suggests will make a positive difference. We also know that SENCOs can't do it alone. If we look at these quotes here, the first one is that no school can be outstanding if it's not inclusive. And the second one, which I think is particularly pertinent here, it's now the responsibility of all leaders and teachers to ensure that the needs of SEND pupils are being fully met. So SENCOs shouldn't be doing this on their own. It's got to be everyone's responsibility. So we must increase the number of classrooms in which high quality teaching meets the needs of all learners. But we can't do it alone, clearly. So I'd like to share 3 things in the time I've got this afternoon. So the first is a framework for considering why people may not easily change their behaviour. So it's sort of abstract, but a useful lens with which to sort of see that it's possible that colleagues aren't working against you, and there may be some reasons why they're not working with you that can be addressed. The second one is around, is just highlighting the recommendations from the EEF's most recent guidance report, which is effective professional development. So if SENCOs or school leaders are planning effective PD around SEND, actually, what are the principles, the mechanisms to make sure that can be successful? And the final thing is some sort of practical suggestions for working with curriculum and phase leads. So in those 3 things, starting fairly abstract and hopefully moving towards something very, very concrete and practical that you'll be able to think about doing in your work in schools. So to start with number 1 then. So this is, we can sometimes feel like colleagues are working against us, and often we give the benefit of the doubt and we go, well, they're very busy, but actually we feel like their priorities aren't quite our priorities. And there's this thing called the combi model, which I think is a really useful way to look at that behaviour and the behaviour of colleagues, because behaviour change is enormously difficult, can be enormously difficult to achieve. And so when looking at that question, why isn't it easy to change people's behaviour, it highlights 3 things there. Sometimes people don't either show the behaviour that you want or change to the behaviour that you need, for example, a particular strategy to adopt within their teaching, for 3 reasons. One is they don't have the capability to do it. So they don't know how that thing can be done. So, and often when we see any hesitancy from colleagues, it's actually an insecurity, isn't it? Because I don't know how I could do that well. I don't know how I could incorporate that into what I normally do. So I won't do it. So it's that capability issue. Another one is motivation. If you may think it's the most important thing for dual coding to take place as part of the teacher exposition from the front of the classroom, but actually, unless your colleague believes that, they're not going to have that effort to change their own resources, their own slides, their own way of teaching. And if you're a curriculum or phase lead, actually, you've really got to buy into that, because you then, as a let's say a head of geography in a secondary or a head of Key Stage 2 in a primary, you then may need to try and affect the behaviour of 5, 6, 7 staff. So, you know, you really need to be bought in and have the motivation and believe that that is a useful thing that's worth doing. And then finally, the opportunity. So it may be that that individual colleague that you're working with around their teaching, they have the ability to do what you're saying. They have the motivation. They can see that it's a good idea, but they know that if their head of department or a member of SLT or someone comes into the lesson tomorrow, they will say, no, we don't do that here. Please don't do that. And then, so actually it's the opportunity. They are able to, they want to, but there are other more external factors that don't allow them the opportunity to do so. So I won't say any more about this combi model other than to say, and I appreciate that that's a sort of fairly abstract way to start, but I think it's just a useful way for thinking. If we're trying to get colleagues to behave in a certain way, i.e. to look at the pupil profiles, these summaries of students' needs, and make sure that their English department are looking at them and teaching in a way that is influenced by them, that if the head of English is not doing that, for example, well, it may not be they're working against you. It may be you need to think about whether they don't have the capability. So, for example, the pupil profile, the strategies you're recommending actually are quite full of jargon and things they don't understand. Could be they don't have the capability, the motivation, or they don't have the opportunity. So please just consider colleagues' behaviour in one of those three ways. And if we think people aren't motivated to make the change that I'm recommending here, then that's what we go ahead and we work on before we proceed. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing I'd like to share is what the evidence says around effective professional development. So there's a bit too much on here for me to read all of, but there are three. I'll just read the headlines on it. So there are three recommendations that come out of the guidance report for effective professional development. So again, this is looking at hundreds of studies around successful PD and unsuccessful PD programs. So it says that actually what you do in particular isn't necessarily the most important thing. Whether you use instructional coaching or lesson study or others, that may not be the most important thing. It's about the mechanisms that are that's the thing that's going to make a difference. And then the second recommendation in yellow talks about what those mechanisms are and talks about choosing one perhaps from each of 4 different groups. So this bit of research identified that successful professional development programs did things from 4 different subcategories, if you like. So they made sure that within their professional development program, there was something that built the knowledge of the people who you expected to go and do the thing. There was something that motivated staff to make that change. There's something that helps them to develop the technique, whatever it is you're asking them to do. And there was something that that then supported them to embed that practice to make sure it wasn't a one-off event. So if you are as a SENCO or a school leader invested in thinking about SEND, actually, if you want to make a change and you've identified what that change is, what you think you'd like colleagues to do more of or less of, then actually having one thing from each of those 4 subcategories is going to be a way to give your PD program the best chance of it being successful based on the evidence that exists out there at the moment. And then finally, that it's done thinking about the context of the school, or thinking about whether if you're trying to make a change where there are 6 other bits of change that teachers are being encouraged to make, then that's clearly going to be too much. So it's thinking about actually what else is going on in this school, where is my school, and if and what becomes an appropriate piece as well as method of professional development. So the challenge for SENCOs and SEND leaders really is then, if we know the mechanisms that are going to be useful for helping colleagues to change their practice in whatever we're trying to change, whatever we're trying to make them do more of. Then I should have given the example here of these 5 strategies that the EEF's research found work for students with SEND in mainstream settings, flexible grouping, etc. You'll see just between those orange lines there. Then the thing to go away and reflect on, I think, as SENCOs and SEND leaders is, can I build a program? Can I do something in my school that means I take the mechanisms and I help staff to implement some of those 5 strategies? There's 5 a day, 5 things that teachers can use in their classroom to help more students with SEND succeed in the mainstream class. Okay, so I'll move on from that, and clearly that doesn't provide you with answers, only questions, and I will talk in slightly less abstract terms in a moment, but just to reflect, firstly, we've talked about that combi model where people aren't showing the behavior or making the behavior changes that you're looking for. It could be about them lacking the capability, motivation, or ability opportunity rather to make those changes. And if you're trying to help colleagues to make those changes, doing it in line with the evidence around good PD programs. But to speak finally in slightly less abstract ways, then I'll talk more practical, concrete suggestions for working with curriculum and phase leads. So what I'm assuming is that I'm talking here to SENCOs and SEND leads from across primary and secondary. And so the kind of colleagues we're looking at will be heads of early years, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and as well as potentially literacy and numeracy leads. And then in secondary schools, we're talking about often heads of department, sometimes heads of year, but really with an academic focus particularly. Slightly different ways of working, perhaps when working with pastoral leads for pastoral benefits explicitly, and really focusing on how we can change classroom practice and ensure maximum academic sort of support and progress for students with SEND. So the first thing to do, I think, as a SENCO, SEND leader, is to work out what you want from your curriculum or phase leads. So often that just means going back to your priorities and going, okay, what am I trying to drive this year in particular? Is it about an explicit focus on the teaching of vocabulary in all classrooms, for example? Is it about a focus on reading? Is it a focus on participation within class discussion and having 100% of students following sort of, taking part in classroom discussion? So the first thing is articulating really what you want from curriculum and phase leads. We can be quite sort of generic and say we want every student with SEND to be thriving in every classroom. And of course that is correct. But actually having a slightly more granular focus on what the changes that you're looking for will be a bit more helpful. And I think will empower curriculum and phase leads to know that they don't need to be the SENCO. They're not being asked to be the SENCO. They're being asked to support a specific teaching and learning related change within the classrooms that they ultimately have some responsibility for. So work out what you want from them, work out what change you want to see, and then how you think that curriculum or phase leads can support you with that. Okay, you then want to find a way where you can work together so that success benefits both of you. So I talked in that combi model about motivation potentially being the reason why people don't enact the behaviours that you want. So if I'm the head of Key Stage 1 and everything's going swimmingly and all students with SEND or otherwise are doing well and behaviour's good, students are attending school well, they are making good progress and engaging well, actually, why do I want to, what's my motivation for making the change that you want me to enact there? But actually, if you can find a way where success benefits both of you, that's going to be the most helpful thing to get buy-in there. So, for example, a head of geography, it may be that if students with SEND aren't making good progress, aren't expected to make good progress by the end of Key Stage 4, based on their Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 4 progress scores, then actually that will bring down the progress scores for the whole of the geography department, and that's not in the head of geography's interest, clearly. So if you have or find or get that data and can see that actually students with SEND who aren't doing so well in geography, then there's a win-win there. If you can work with that head of geography, they're going to naturally be bought into the change you're going to encourage, as long as it's good change, because they'll see that will make a difference to the classrooms that they have responsibility for, and ultimately for the grades that students get. And likewise, if self-regulation is an issue within year 4, there are a few students who are struggling to self-regulate, then working with the Key Stage 2 phase lead around a classroom environment that supports self-regulation, that's going to be a win-win, because the teachers who work with Key Stage 2 are going to be better able to teach with classrooms where students are regulated, are calm, are ready for learning. So that's going to be a win-win. I think the problem SENCOs sometimes have is where they try and solve these problems on their own. They forget that there are middle leaders who are responsible as well for certain cohorts, like students who pick geography or students in Key Stage 2. So they try and either do these things on their own, or they don't find ways that are going to be mutually beneficial, and that's what I think this should promote here. So working together so that success benefits both of you. Okay, the next, hopefully very practical and doable, pragmatic sort of point here is about finding ways to sustain any partnership work, so it's not a one-off event. So I talked perhaps about geography and data, so that might be a good example. The grades in the middle of year 10 show actually that students with SEND in geography aren't doing so well. So, you might send the head of geography an email and say, oh, a bit worried about this, what should we do? Well, here's a bit of, here's some strategies that you can try and enact in your department, and let me know if you have any problems. And clearly that's unlikely to be an approach that makes real change, because it's one-off, it's coming without much guidance, and clearly that's what's needed. So where it's partnership work, it should be, okay, well do we have, do you meet as a SENCO perhaps with every middle leader every half term for a discussion on the progress of students with SEND in particular, from early years right the way up to Key Stage 5? Would that be a good approach? Every middle leader every half term, for example, would that be a way to sustain it? Would it be that there is something that happens annually with every leader with a responsibility, and it's a piece of work that takes sort of perhaps over 2 or 3 weeks, and then is revisited later in the year, but is essentially an annual focus on each phase or each department within the school? And I think going back to the EEF guidance on effective professional development is a good place to return to with this, to go, okay, what are those ways that I can make sure that any professional development or any change I want to see isn't just a one-off event, but can be sustained. Okay, so it's about making it sustained rather than a one-off event. The next one here is about making your work systematic. So using existing systems where they exist and building new ones where you need to. So for example, if you want to make some changes with middle leaders, what happens already that mean you don't need to try and build momentum of those things? So are there meeting cycles? Do the middle leaders meet as a whole group once every half term, the phase leads, the curriculum leads? And what you need to do is just make sure that the relevant member of SLT or the head teacher, whoever it is who sort of leads and organises those meetings, knows that you should be a part of them, certainly to attend and hopefully to present, to share, to lead sections also. So is there a system of meetings that is going to help you to achieve the behaviour change that you want? Now, change doesn't happen just in meetings, of course. So if there's monitoring cycles, learning walks and observations and that kind of thing, actually, are you as a SENCO involved in those? I know I'm talking to some SENCOs here, not all, but is the SENCO involved in those? And so where those systems of monitoring already exist, the SENCO isn't trying to add work to anyone, they're just trying to get in on the work that's already existing. And likewise, if your school does a sort of an annual review of a certain key stage or review of a certain subject area, sometimes as a SENCO, it's just making sure you're involved in that rather than it happening and then you having to do something else separately. It could be that there are progress sort of there's progress monitoring meetings that happen between every phase lead or curriculum lead and the head teacher every term. So again, should the SENCO sit in on those every single time they happen, or on some of them, or on particular department areas or phases where there are some concerns around SEND? So how is the SENCO or SEND leaders involved in that process there? And then where learning walks are happening, are they happening jointly? Because it's all well for the SENCO to go around, look at lots of Year 7 classes and then send an email back to the head of Year 7, but actually going around with the head of Year 7 jointly and going, okay, do we agree, do we see eye to eye that this is the issue and these are the things we can change, and then we can make a plan for how to change them. So it may be some joint action planning with the head of whatever. It's going to be a useful next step here. So we've seen this, we've agreed on joint sort of review of what's going on in your area. Here's 5 actions that we both agree are useful. Now let's work at who's going to do them and when we're going to come back to these. So it's just about trying to find those systems that already exist. And if you need to build new systems, then maybe you just need to. Maybe you need your SENCO to be going every month and there's a particular lens on a different area of the school, and it's every month I work with a certain curriculum department who wants to be first. And if that becomes a system, it then becomes expected that you work with every single head of phase or head of curriculum for a certain length of time every year, and that's revisited at other times of the year. So you may need to build your own system, but where a system already exists, let's use those wherever we can. And the final point for me is to reflect on how explicit and how clear you've been. So if we're looking at working with colleagues, we really can't afford to have SEND as a sort of mystified thing that people don't understand. But we also can't expect everyone to have a master's level education in SEND in order to be able to understand what we're talking about. So things like where you've shared information, have you shared it well, or is it hidden on some secret area of your staff intranet that is going to be impossible to find? Things like where we've got a one-page summary of a pupil's needs and some strategies, actually for a layman or a teacher, non-SEND specialist looking at those, are they implementable? Are they even comprehensible? Do they understand what you're asking them to do and what you're saying the students' needs are? If we're talking about receptive and expressive language scores, okay, well, I would bet that most staff actually, they might be able to work it out, but they don't explicitly know what those things mean, many teaching staff and TAs. So actually making sure that you've written things on, if we expect people to do something, you made it really clear what that is. And that also comes back to the priorities, as I mentioned earlier. If you think, if you've identified that reading, vocabulary, non-invasive behaviour management, whatever the thing is that you've identified as an issue across your school or across pockets of your school, actually have you articulated that really clearly? Sometimes all you might need to say to a really good head of department or head of phase is students are struggling with X, I think we all need to do Y. And really good head of phase, a really good head of department will take that seriously, listen to what you're saying is an issue, and then think about what that means for them in their area. So what I hope I've done this afternoon is to introduce one sort of fairly abstract combi model way of thinking about, well, how do we why does behavior change sometimes not happen? Then something a bit more concrete and very evidence-based around what effective professional development looks like, and how ways that can be successful and be sustained. And then finally looked at some quite practical examples for what you as a SENCO or a SEND leader might do to go and work with curriculum and phase leads in a really concrete way. But really where it starts is knowing how you want to use them, know what you want from them, and then we think about how that can happen in practice, what school systems there are, how the combi model might create some blocks, and how a good professional development program might help it to happen in reality. So just to say, my apologies again for not being able to be with you at Whole School Send live today, but my details are on the slide there, and it's been a real pleasure contributing to the session today. Thank you very much.
Well, that's the end of Gary's video. He couldn't be with us today, but I think it's just maybe worth us reflecting on what we've looked at in the full session. And if you do have any questions, if you just put them into the chat. What Gary was suggesting at the end there about having a really specific focus when working with curriculum leaders, I thought that was really helpful, and we can think about Emily's case study, but also think about using the EEF guidance, so being really specific with staff when we're asking them to do something. I mentioned earlier that quality first teaching can seem very general and not all staff understand what that means. The EEF is really helpfully has got those 5 recommendations. And I'd also recommend you have a look at our teacher handbook, particularly if you're working with subject specialists, because then you can be really clear, you know, in science do this, in MFL have a look at these strategies, and hopefully that will help colleagues. Yeah. Has anyone got any questions? I will just have a look in the chat. So a few people have asked about where are the slides going to be. So you will get an email if you've registered for this webinar, and there will be the full slide pack. And we're also going to pull together a document with all of the links that we've referred to, because we've done a lot of signposting and mentioning resources. So we're going to pull all of the links together. And I know Emily's quite happy to share her resources that she showed on screen. So all of those will be available along with the slides with the Ofsted data with all of those collated statements. So all of that will be put together in a big pack and sent out to you. And you can also watch the recording again. So there's a few people asking. Link to the previous sessions that is already on the gateway. And will be in the slide pack as well, because I would recommend going back and watching the first 2 if you haven't. Right, I think that's everything. No one's got any specific questions. Someone's got to go on gate duty. It's probably a sign that we're going to end. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's attended the series and attended this session. It's been really interesting, and thank you for all your comments. And hopefully we'll see you soon at Whole School Send. We've got a whole range of new training opportunities coming up in spring term. So there's lots of thank yous and questions coming up. In terms of the handbook about early years, I think there is a section on early years. If you look at the table of contents, you'll be able to click on that and find it. And lots of thank yous. Yeah, the events calendar's up there, but we will pull together all the documents and links. So thank you very much. We'll end the session there.